Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a premier field engineer specializing in system-centered technologies. Today's discussion will be part 3 of an ongoing series regarding Configuration Manager 2012 Data Replication. Part 3 will be focused on specifically Config Manager SQL Replication. I say it that way on purpose. I'll explain that in a bit. Specifically, a deep dive on this topic. This session should wrap up the series on the data replication in Configuration Manager 2012. All right, so let's get started and spend some time digging into here. So this session, really want to start and highlight what I list here as a disclaimer. This is the list of the things we're going to do in this session, but we'll start with a disclaimer. I'll talk to you about that in a minute. We're going to go through basically what Config Manager SQL Replication is, sort of the concepts behind it, how it works, show it to you with some behind-the-scenes information, talk about troubleshooting, and then we'll hit something called CEDO, which you might not think really is Config Manager SQL Replication, but it relies on it and so is integral to it, and then that will wrap us up. So let's get into this. In terms of the disclaimer, Config Manager 2012 highly relies on Config Manager SQL Replication in a hierarchy, right? If you have a standalone primary site, there really is no Config Manager SQL Replication. There's no sites to replicate to. For hierarchies, Config Manager SQL Replication can be complex. This session is going to show you how to deal with Config Manager SQL Replication, how it works, how to troubleshoot it. But understand that working through these things can be confusing, potentially, especially if you don't do it all the time. And you should be working with someone who is knowledgeable about how this works as you work through troubleshooting it, right? Okay, enough said. And so there will be also some things that I will show you in here that I'll probably caution you again at the time, but they are things that you can manipulate, but they're not always things that you should manipulate, all right? So again, we'll touch on those more as we go along. So in terms of what is Config Manager SQL Replication, again, I'm saying it specifically that way for a reason. Because Config Manager SQL Replication is not simply SQL replication. They're two very different things. So if you're a Config Manager admin and you go talk to a DBA and you mention Config Manager SQL Replication, they're going to think about something totally different than what we use, right? So the key difference with Config Manager SQL Replication is it does not leverage the SQL engine. It leverages the broker service, and we'll see more about that in a minute. The type of data that we move with Config Manager SQL Replication is pretty much everything in the system except binary content. So in session 2, we walk through how data flows through a hierarchy if we're doing things like distributing software update content, the actual update files themselves, if we're deploying source files for a package or an application or something like that. Here, we're talking about all the metadata associated with various aspects of managing a site. So that could be site control data, it could be application metadata, package metadata, software update groups, could be client settings. All of that, right, moves through this mechanism called Config Manager SQL Replication. In terms of the complexity, it is a pretty complex system how replication works, right? The good news is that it generally works really, really well. There's a lot of redundancy built into the engine for Config Manager SQL Replication. And there's a lot of checks where we'll go repair things if things are wrong. But occasionally it will break, right? And so if you are in an environment that will, scale-wise, can be handled by a single standalone primary site, you're going to save yourself that complexity by just leveraging a single standalone primary site. And that's what I recommend. If you can do it simply, then why do it with more complexity, right? And there are also inherent delays that can take place for replication. You'll see some of those in just a minute. So food for thought, I'll mention that again as we roll along. All right, so most of the rest of our time together, we're going to spend actually looking at some things live in the environment to understand how all this works. In terms of ConfigMgr SQL Replication concepts, there are a few things that I want to show you and talk about first. So as we look at the scope of the data that needs to be replicated across the hierarchy, we're talking in terms of having a CAS as the brain, if you will, of the hierarchy, the central management component of the hierarchy. And then we have child primaries underneath, one or more, right? Well, there's a concept of breaking the data into two categories. There's a concept of global data. There's a concept of site data. Global data is that data from the database that needs to be present on every site server in the hierarchy. Site data is that data that does not replicate to every site server in the hierarchy. All it does is replicate to the CAS. So if you have a primary site server, there's a certain subset of data there that will only be present at that primary site server and the CAS. The CAS has everything. But for site data, not every primary shares that data. Again, examples of that as we go along. So as we look at the total database of items that we could replicate, right, we're going to break that data down into finite chunks of manageable components for replication called replication groups so that we can control replication more finitely and monitor replication more focused and so on. I'll show you those, right, in just a minute. And then we'll talk a bit about monitoring replication. So that said, let's just go ahead and pull the lab environment in, and we'll spend a few minutes. So the first stop, we're going to spend a lot of time just looking at SQL today. First thing I want to show you is just an example of how we now break things apart in the database. Now again, what I'm showing you is not to encourage you to go change things here, but just to learn how the system works, right? Knowing how it works enables us to be able to work with it more effectively, troubleshoot it, that kind of thing. So as we look through the various database tables, you'll find some. I'm just going to go to the SMS packages tables. And we'll see, so in ConfigMgr 2007, we just had a single SMS packages table. Here we have two, because we have a G and an L, right? As you might guess, the G represents global data, this package table that is going to contain global data for packages, and this one represents local data or site-based data, right? So you'll see other ones as I scroll through here, right? But that's just enough to illustrate. So even our database tables, they're flagged in many cases to show global versus local, right? Again, the CAS will store everything. Some data only is on the primary in CAS, but other data is across the entire hierarchy. So to understand that, we can look at replication groups and see what data is flagged a certain way. So if we want to understand how the database tables are organized by replication group, it's pretty easy. We can just run a simple SQL query against a view right here and find out all of the different replication groups. Now this doesn't tell us the tables, right? But it tells us how many groups we have, and there's a lot we can learn. So here's the ID specifically of the group that we'll leverage in a minute. Then the replication pattern, whether it's globally replicated data, site replicated data, and there is a cloud replicated data for cloud device management point, which is Intune and such, but mostly global and site data, right? So we'll see that we have replication groups here for replication configuration. We have configuration data, site configuration. If we scroll down, we'll see hardware inventory, a number of hardware inventory tables. There's a lot of hardware inventory tables, and so again, we don't want to have to manage them all collectively. We'll break them down logically into chunks that are easier to deal with, easier to monitor, and so on, right? So and you can see all this. Now, other things you'll see, synchronized interval, right? You'll see a lot of these are synchronized every minute between sites. Some are every 5 minutes. So one might think, this is where we're doing it, so I'm going to get in here and change this to be at a time that makes more sense to me. Great thought, don't do that, right? this is one of those things that is an educational thing to look at, but don't touch this. Managing and changing replication without knowing what you're doing is a bad thing. And we don't change replication. These settings are this way for a purpose. If you want to change anything about replication, there are some knobs you can turn. Those are in the console, and I'll show those to you a bit later on. But this is what it is by default. Right, here's one that's 2 minutes and so on. But most of the data goes every minute. Right, then there's other information that you can see: replication priority, different priorities assigned to different kind of data, and so on. Right. So then the question might come up, okay, so I understand we group the database together and segment it out into these things called replication groups to be able to manage it. Well, what's in a replication group? Well, let's take a couple. So we can take hardware inventory, maybe collection membership, and then maybe configuration data, right, and look at it. So we can do that with a query as well. Here, oops, helps if I type right, doesn't it? Let's see. Can't talk and type at the same time. So there's 3 that I want to look at. I'll start with hardware inventory. That's going to be replication ID 24. Then we'll move to collection and see. So if I look at the replication ID 24, which is down here, my top hardware inventory replication group, and run that, then I can tell these are the tables that are included in this particular replication group. Again, a subset of the overall hardware inventory scheme, right? Or I can look at replication group ID 16, which is going to be for my collections. Run that one, and I can see here are the key tables for collections as we replicate them across, right? Or I can look at collection ID, I believe it's 2 or 3, either one, it'll work. So here's the site control information, more tables, and we control them and lump them together for replication and so on. So pretty easy to understand, first of all, what replication groups are, and then second of all, what's contained within a replication group. So we'll spend more time in the database here in a bit, but we'll leave it for now. Let me move this down. Actually, I'll leave it where it is. And let's go to the console. So one of the things that you're going to want to do, now that you're hopefully getting a flavor for how important replication is and how involved replication is and how much it works and such, one of the things you're going to want to do is really keep a good handle on how replication is performing in your environment. We'll hit this again. There's another gatekeeper, if you will, that is time sensitive, that if there's a replication problem, you really do need to know about it, right? So I'll mention that again in a minute. But as far as monitoring replication, under the monitoring node, we have a section called database replication. So here I just have a CAS and I have a primary site. All I have is one link. You will have one link for every child primary that you have. There's secondaries too. But this is where we care about, CAS to primaries. What you want to see is that link is active, right? And you'll get some details about the link and how often or last time we've replicated and global data and different things, right? There are a couple of additional statuses that you might see for link status or link state. One of them is degraded. Link is degraded, right? Another is link failed. So what does that mean, right? If the link has failed, we're not replicating, right? We're not at all. If it's degraded, then we might still be doing some replication, but it's not acting like it should, right? So really, this gives you a pretty good insight. It's not really real time, right? There's some things that, some timers and things that will go along with this, and how long a link's been dead and that kind of thing. But it's a good indicator. If it's showing active, that's thumbs up. Everything's okay. If it's degraded, you want to get in here and understand why, right? So one of the ways that you can understand why is to leverage this thing called the replication link analyzer, right? Now this is a wizard that will go through and check your replication links. And I know when I first saw this, I thought, a wizard, great. it's not going to help me that much. A troubleshooter, really, troubleshooting wizard. It's not going to help me that much. It's kind of like status messages. They're great to give an indicator of a problem, but they don't really solve the issue. That's not what this is. Replication Leak Analyzer is actually very, very good, and you should leverage it as a first tool if there are problems. There are checks built in here. There are remediation steps built in here, and different things that you will want to leverage at least to get an idea of what's going on in your environment. So right now, everything is healthy. No problem at all. So I'm just going to run Replication Leak Analyzer, and it's going to come back fairly quickly and say there's no problem, right, as you'd expect here. All right, so we'll just let it run for a second. Shouldn't take all that long. There we go. All right, troubleshooting report. This is what you want to see. It tells you the kind of checks that we went through, right? Did a pretty thorough check just to make sure, and everything came back green. So that's good. Now, we can view the log. The log is really good because it tells us all the checks that went through, different result sets and all that kind of thing. Red isn't necessarily bad. It's just some keywords that are causing the line probably to go red, right? But then we also have the ability to view a report. So the report is just XML that walks us through the different checks that took place, right? And it'll tell us if there's an error or not. So if you go through here, you can see, is SQL Server version correct? True. True or false as a result set, whether things are good to go or not. This report becomes very useful if there's actually a problem. You can see a little bit more detail about what that problem is. Right? Now, sometimes you won't get an option for viewing the log or viewing the report, depending on what the nature of the problem is. So to show you what I mean, I'm going to come over here to my other server. This is just the primary site. And I'm just going to go into the control panel and turn on the firewall. Actually, I have two instances open. Let me get rid of that. Turn on the firewall so that I cannot communicate with this box. Right? So let me do that. So on. Okay. So now replication is effectively broken because I can't communicate with the box. I don't have to wait for link is active. I can just run the link analyzer and it will tell me, checking connectivity down, and it's going to sit here and then it's going to come back and say, hey, I can't even get to the box, right? So even though your link shows active right now, you can still run the analyzer and then we're going to surface problems if we see them. It's a good idea, probably just as a regular check in your environment, to just occasionally go in and run the link analyzer just to make sure, because replication is such a critical part of operation in a hierarchy. All right, so I don't have the ability to look at logs here. It's pretty obvious I have a connectivity issue because it tells me that, and so I need to go fix that. And when I go fix that, then everything starts to work again, right? Well, I'm going to leave it broken for now because I want to be able to have some things piled up, kind of not being able to send in terms of replication for a few minutes whenever I get to another section where I'm going to show you some things. So let's go continue talking about this. So other things in this particular database replication node would be link properties. Right? Now this has modified a bit since RTM, give you a little bit more control. So one of the things that we give you an option to do in, I think it was SP1, maybe it was R2, I can't remember. I think it was SP1 though, where we introduced it. Before we made this change specifically here, where we enabled distributed views, if you want to, then all of the data for the database had to be replicated back and forth. Now, there's certain kinds of data, hardware inventory, software inventory, metering data, and status messages specifically, that you can choose not to replicate between sites. Instead, if you have a very fast network connection between your primary sites, then you can just have distributed views working, meaning that whenever the data for hardware inventory, maybe at a child primary, is needed, maybe you run something on the CAS that needs the data for hardware inventory of clients on a primary child, We just connect across the network and pull it out of the database tables at the primary child, and that's it. We don't have to actually store it in the CAS database. Most customers I've come across don't leverage this, but at least it's an interesting option to give administrators a bit more control over what's going on. Other things, we can impact the replication data summary, how often we put that up to show the summary of replication traffic and different things for a given link. By default, 15 minutes. Here, we give you the ability to impose rate limits, if you will, on the network connection between databases. Now, notice we don't allow you to throttle all of the replication data, only the 3 categories I mentioned in the previous tab. So, and that's going to be probably a lot of your big data anyway, right? The other is pretty critical data. We don't want any delays whenever we're communicating that back and forth, and so we just give you the ability to throttle here. Here, nothing's throttled. And then alerts, right? So alerting is something new in 2012. And if you haven't begun exploring it, it's actually a good thing to have on in many areas, particularly here, right? Database replication between ConfigMgr sites is critical to have running well. And instead of having to constantly go check it, you probably should poke in there and check it occasionally. But if there's a problem, you want to be alerted of that pretty quick, right? And this would be a good place to set up alerts. You can set up emails to let you know what's going on and that kind of thing, right? So that's available on this tab. Cool. Other things. So parent database properties, child database properties. If you look at this, this should look very familiar to you. In fact, it is basically a repeat of the screen that we would get under the administration. If we go to the CAS and go to properties, it's the exact same screen. The only difference is there's no database tab over here. So if I go to monitoring again, parent database properties, here's a database tab, right? So here's the option to configure the SQL Server Service Broker port, 4022 by default. Right? No reason really typically to change it unless you are hosting multiple ConfigMgr databases on a single server. Let me clear that up. You cannot host multiple ConfigMgr databases on the same instance on a SQL server. You can have multiple instances on a SQL server and have one ConfigMgr database in each instance. Doing that, though, you can't share the SQL Server Service Broker port, so you would have to have it modified for each of the instances. That's how I run my SQL Server in my lab. Not this lab, in one of my other labs. So 4022 typically is the default. Typically, that's not an issue. And that's the port that the SQL servers will use to talk to each other on for broker traffic, right? Then we have enable data compression just to make the sending more streamlined. That's on by default. And then here's the data retention, right? So what does data retention means? This means if you have a problem with one of your sites, so say that you are a primary and you're replicating with the CAS, and the CAS is replicating with you. For some reason, the CAS goes down. You can't communicate with the CAS. But you don't want to lose the data. You want to be able to communicate with the CAS when it comes back up. We're going to spool up the data on the primary site that needs to be replicated until the CAS becomes available, or until we get past this data retention timeout of 5 days. So if it's greater than 5 days when the CAS comes back online, we're not going to trust that the data is intact enough, and we're just going to resynchronize the entire data structure with the CAS. Now here's the rub. One of the knee-jerk things, or one of the common practices, I wouldn't say knee-jerk, for administrators is if, let's go to ConfigMgr 2007. If the central site in 2007 were to go down, then they would go to the child primaries and begin operating on the child primaries, creating packages, collections, that kind of thing, so they could still service the environment. That also might be the tendency to do in a ConfigMgr 2012 environment. And as long as the CAS operation is restored within this 5-day window, that's fine. The problem is, if the CAS is restored after this 5-day window, all of those changes that you made at the primary site, we don't trust them. They're not valid within this 5-day window, and we just overwrite every single one of them, right? So that's something to be careful for, right? Now, the next thought might be, okay, well, I'm just going to increase this from 5 to something larger, maybe 14, whatever. Understand that thought, but that should not happen. You should not modify this number, right? In RTM, we did not even let you see this. We did add this later to allow you to have the flexibility to modify it. I wish we wouldn't have in some ways, because it's possibly going to lead down the road of database backlogs and different things, and maybe even inconsistency in some cases, whatever, if you were to bump this forward, right? Okay, so in fact, maybe it was an RTM. I can't remember for sure. I don't think it was, but if it is there, cool, but I don't think it was. Anyway, maybe. So leave this at default, right? But also understand the urgency. If replication is down, you need to fix it within this window, right? So that things come back up, they're consistent, everything's good to go, and so on. Okay? All right, good enough. And we can look at the other tab here, look at the child database properties. It would be the same kind of thing. All the tabs here, these are more tabs because it's a primary site. The only thing different is the database tab, and we have the same settings, right? All right. So enough for now. Let's move out of the demo environment and move back to the PowerPoint here. So understanding now what SQL Broker is, how does it actually work, right? And that's what I want to spend a little bit of time talking about now. So how it works, basically, you see a diagram. I'll talk about that in a minute. ConfigMgr SQL Replication basically means SQL Broker. So when we talk about ConfigMgr SQL Replication, we're talking about ConfigMgr leveraging the SQL Service Broker service to make these data transmissions between sites, right? So SQL Service Broker, I'll show you more about it in a minute, but it is an engine that provides some real good consistency and delivery for data that's queued up in the various SQL Service Broker queues, right? Okay, so in terms of SQL Broker configuration, replication configuration, there's a couple of things to call out. First thing, so after you install ConfigMgr, so say that you have a CAS and you have a child primary, you've got them installed, right? After the installation, every bit of traffic that goes between these sites, outside of the content stuff that we talked about, let me say it better. Every bit of replication traffic that goes between these sites will leverage the SQL Server Broker service. The only exceptions are two. The first one is whenever you're first installing the primary sites. Say that you have a CAS and you want to add a new primary. You're going to add that new primary and link it up with the CAS. Whenever that link up happens, the CAS will need to replicate all of its data from the database down to that child primary. That's a lot of data, potentially, you know. So we don't leverage SQL Service Broker to do that. Instead, we leverage bulk file copy out of the CAS database. We'll put that through the sender-based sending mechanism on the CAS down to the child primary. When it gets to the child primary, then we will leverage bulk copy of that data into the database, right? Gives us the advantage of having the senders and the throttling and all of that. That's one. The second scenario is if we ever need to reinitialize replication between sites, that's going to basically cause the same thing to happen. We're going to bulk copy out from whichever site and bulk copy into whatever destination site. Beyond those two things, then all of the data replication will take place through SQL Service Broker, right? Okay. One of the issues I found recently working through a CU3 upgrade, SP1 CU3 upgrade, as I recall, was that for whatever reason, SQL Server Broker Service lost the ability to authenticate between SQL servers. It was a pretty interesting issue to track down and a bit tedious to solve. Once we solved it, it was all good. But that leads to this diagram. Right. By the way, all that authentication, the certificate exchange, I'm going to talk about whatever, that's tracked in the HMAN log of the site, so you can look at that. Bottom line, SQL Service Broker leverages these things that I'm representing here, these certificates, for authentication. Right. So whenever this SQL server, for example, needs to send data to the CAS, it's going to authenticate with its certificate. And when the CAS needs to send data down, it's going to authenticate with its certificate back and forth. Now, this is a process that is set up for you automatically. You should probably never even have to see this unless there's a problem, and there generally aren't problems in this area. In this diagram, we have the the CAS server here, the database server here, the primary server here, database server, primary server, database server. And I'm just showing that the primary servers and the CAS talk to the database on port 1433 by default, right? The SQL servers are the one that communicate back and forth. The SQL Server broker services communicate back and forth on the SQL servers using, by default, port 4022. Okay, they authenticate with their certificates. So if there's issues with the broker services communicating, if there's replication issues, whatever, you'll certainly see it in the console. It could go as deep as needing to get in and adjust the certificates, make sure there's pathways, that kind of thing. All of those things are possible. That's getting into SQL and troubleshooting. We're not going to dive into it that deeply here, but understanding again the mechanism, how this works, is good. I kind of parallel it in my mind, the whole certificate exchange between SQL servers, kind of like in ConfigMgr 2007 and 2012 too, where we need to exchange certificates between primary sites in order to send data between them. So you might have come across an issue in 2007 where you join a site to a hierarchy. We need to have certificates exchanged. Maybe they don't exchange correctly, so you have to go in and use a utility called preinst, key for parent, key for child, make those certificates imported to the sites. Then they can use them to sign data going back and forth, and everything works. Similar situation here, except you don't use preinst to deal with these certificates. There's other ways to do it because it's native SQL. Same idea. The data going from one SQL server to another has to be signed by a certificate, or has to be leveraging a certificate to authenticate back and forth so that we can pass the data. All right? Cool. Now, there are ways to modify the SQL Service Broker port. SQL Server Service Broker port. Say that 5 times quickly. One of the ways is through setup. So you generally don't have to modify it, but as I alluded to with my other lab environment where I have 3 instances of SQL on the same box, so I can have all of my ConfigMgr databases there, I had to change the port that Broker uses. There's a way to do that. It's not difficult, right? One of the ways that you specified is in setup. So you have to configure SQL Server to use the right broker port, and then you configure ConfigMgr to leverage that broker port. After SQL is installed, if there's a reason or a need to change the broker port, you can do that too. The actual port information is stored just in the registry, and you saw it also on this screen if you remember this database properties screen. Here's the broker port, right? You can change it there, or you can actually see it in the registry too. So this is my CAS. I'm going to maintain port information for all of my child primaries that I need to replicate with. So I'll go into regedit. Let me pop up here a little bit and look under SQL Server right here. And then I will have my PC sites, and this is my child site, and in here I will store the SQL Server broker port. Right, so it's all exposed. It can be changed. You can do it through a site reset too, as I recall. So it's all there. Okay. So as we showed on the other demos we did a minute ago, the replication of data happens fairly frequently. It's either 1 to 5 minutes. There were a couple in there that were 2, but most of them were 1 and 5. Again, that's not something you should change. It depends on the data type. All that's pre-configured for you, but it happens routinely fairly frequently to keep everything up to date, right? So one of the questions that might come up, okay, SQL Server, broker service, understand it, that's cool. Why would you not just leverage SQL replication natively, right? Why use the broker service? Well, there are a couple of advantages to leveraging it. First of all, it's a queue-based service, so we can basically just drop off the data that we need to replicate in the queue, let SQL take care of it, right? It's also, broker is engineered to provide what's called guaranteed delivery of data. So I put that kind of in quotes, right? At least in my mind. Because there's a lot of things that could break the ability of broker to be able to deliver its data. One of them is in place now. I've disabled my firewall. We can't get to it. We can't deliver the data. But it's in the queue and it's waiting for this connection to open up and then it will dump it all forward. Other things could come into play, like a broken networking or DNS issues or whatever, right? But as long as the servers are able to communicate and they're healthy, then it's a guaranteed type of delivery. We don't have to keep tending it and keep trying to send it and all of that. Broker just takes care of itself, right? All right, so just like ConfigMgr has a number of components that it relies on to get its job done, broker does as well. Right, so let's look at the components of broker real quick and see what those look like. So if we pull back in SQL Server for a minute, or the site for a minute, and just pop into SQL, and look at the ConfigMgr database, let me go collapse that. All right, we will see the service broker entry right here. So each database has the service broker, and under the service broker, we don't have tables and such because it's not really a database. It's a service running on the database. We have different types of configurations we can put in place. We have message types that we can configure and build out for broker service to deal with. We have, expand. We have contracts. So contracts are very similar to the contracts that you and I might sign, guaranteeing that certain data will be delivered at a certain kind of cadence, whatever. You'll see a contract for high priority data, critical priority data, normal priority data. We can look at the properties of the contract and understand who the owner is and different configurations about it, right? Won't dig into this, but you can later if you would like to. All right. Other things here. So we will have queues. So the queues are interesting. So this would be queues where data is placed as it's waiting to transit from one SQL server to the next. So you can go through and look at the properties of these queues and see detail about it, that kind of thing. I can go look at different, detail about it, see how much data is in a given queue. Right now there's none in this one, right? I can just run through and select various ones. Hopefully there should be some data backlogged, right? I could go through each one, but the one that I really care about, the main one that's in place, is this thing called a transmission queue. So the transmission queue is what broker uses to store data that's in transit from one site to the next. On a healthy site, that queue should be empty. Usually, might have a little bit in it on a very busy production site, but should generally be empty. Mine's a lab, so typically mine should be empty. If I show the transmission queue here, it's empty because I haven't changed anything, right? So you'll remember that I enabled my firewall on my child site, right? So I cannot send data down to my child site right now. But I haven't actually made a configuration change in ConfigMgr. So I'm going to go do that right now. I'm going to go into my software library, go edit this task sequence. I'm just going to edit this, whatever. And I'll just remove the word test. I'm going to say OK. So that will trigger a need for replication between my sites. And if I go and look at the transmission queue now, I hopefully will have data. Nope, not yet. So it will be there. Hopefully it should be there now already. I'm surprised it's not. There it is. Okay, it just took a second to show up. So this is data in transit trying to go from the CAS to my primary site. So this is the to-service name showing the destination down to PR1. Here's the broker instance that we're using, more detail about it, from the CAS service. Here's the priority it's going at. So this goes to our contracts, as you can tell. How long it's, or when it went into the queue, right? Message types and so on. If we scroll on over, we'll actually see the message body, which you can't really read. And then we'll see, where did I miss it? That's what I'm looking at. I'm looking for transmission status. It's been in there just a short amount of time. And interesting. So it moved through. How did it do that? Oh, because I have exceptions. That's my bad. Okay, so let me go do this again. So this time I'm going to stop the SQL Server service down here. Instead of doing the firewall, let me stop the SQL Server service. So here's the SQL Server. I'm going to stop it. Move that back out of the way while it stops. And then I'll go make a change again. And hopefully we will see things not be able to communicate this time. Put test back in. Apply it. All good. Then if we go to SQL and do our query again, now we have detail back in here as it's trying to move. And this time, look, this is what I was missing before because it actually did move. Transmission status. An error occurred. We can't get down to that server because I just stopped the SQL service, right? So that makes sense why. But it's interesting, if you look in here and you see things backlogged, we try to tell you what's going on. Now, there's some other places we can look for troubleshooting as well, but this is a good one, right? Okay, so let's keep going. All right, so as we mentioned, CAS is really the source hierarchy. Let me get this out of the way. CAS is really the source hierarchy for replication. As you create objects on the CAS, CAS is typically the focus of administration. As you create objects on the CAS, we're going to send them down to the child sites. If you are working on the child sites, we're going to send that information at least to the CAS and maybe to the other primary sites, depending on what it is, right? All right. So then the question sometimes comes up about standalone primaries. So I mentioned as we got started that a standalone primary can actually help you avoid some of the complexity of ConfigMgr SQL Replication. Not that ConfigMgr SQL Replication is bad, it's not. It works well most of the time. But if you don't have a need for that, why add the confusion to your mix, right? Standalone primary sites can support up to 100,000 clients. That's more than enough for most environments without the added necessity for ConfigMgr SQL Replication. If you add a secondary, though, you're going to add back in the need for at least some portion of ConfigMgr SQL Replication. Why? Why, right? The question is because in 2007, secondaries didn't have a need for SQL. In 2012, every secondary site must have SQL. So to get data down to that secondary site SQL Express database, we've got to have a way to do it, and that method is through ConfigMgr SQL Replication. All right, cool. So let's move on. Talk about troubleshooting for a minute. Okay, so in terms of troubleshooting this, right? It's a pretty complex component, but don't be afraid of it. We actually give a lot of troubleshooting tools to help you understand what's going on, to help you be able to hopefully fix some things that are going wrong. One of the requirements of ConfigMgr SQL Replication should go without saying, but sometimes it's missed, is the SMS executive has to run. The components that control ConfigMgr SQL Replication are dependent, are embedded, are threads of the SMS executive. So I've even gone and started digging into replication without even checking the SMS executive to see if it was running. Sometimes it's not. If it's not running, that could be the total reason that replication is not working, right? So make sure that the SMS executive is running. Assuming that's the case, then there are other tools we can bring to bear to understand why replication is failing, right? We've already talked about the replication link analyzer, talked about the associated logging that can be viewed through there. Beyond the replication link analyzer, we have our requisite ConfigMgr logs. So if we pull in the environment, let me show those to you. So there's one key configuration manager log right here, RCM control. Right? If you look at it, it's a pretty busy log. It's monitoring the replication environment. It's going to attempt to repair things. So if maybe a SQL broker queue is missing, it'll try to repair that. If permissions aren't right, it'll try to repair that and different things, right? So you can see things working here as we're going through and doing our sync and looking for activations and cleaning the inbox and different things, right? So this is a good log to be able to keep tabs on. If there are problems, we should surface a lot of detail here. Now, sometimes if you're troubleshooting a replication issue, the amount of detail that's in this log isn't enough. You might want to get as much detail as you can. So, like many of our threads, you can actually increase verbosity of logging in the registry. So in this case, I can go down to, or go up to Components, go down to Replication Control Manager, Manager here, Replication Configuration Monitor, that's what I want, and here's verbose logging, right? So I can just simply turn this to 2, and it will add more detail, the most detail, into my RCM control log, right? Which is good and helpful for troubleshooting. In addition to that, I have the standard tracing key that we've had around for a long time, where I can enable, by turning to 1, SQL tracing. Many threads in the executive are able to take advantage of logging SQL commands as they run in the environment, and this is no different, right? So another option. Okay, so that's some of the standard config manager related logs. There are other things that we can look at as well. So the broker service is a SQL component. It provides logs as well, right? There's 2 places we can go for the logs. One is just the error logs. So if you want to look at any of the error or log information going on SQL, you can come under Management, look at the SQL Server logs, look at the current log, and you can see detail about what's going on. So broker logs into this log as we go along. If there's errors, you will see them. You should see them in here. So you can see some detail about broker probably as you search this. The issue that I was telling you about before, where we had SQL broker was failing to authenticate because of unrecognized certificates, it took a minute to get to the log here, but once we got to the error log, it was very clear what the problem was. And getting to a resolution was a little bit complicated, but fairly quick once we saw what the failure was, right? So take a look at SQL error log and see what it's showing you. It's good information. In addition to the SQL error log, we can also look at a query in SQL let me get rid of some of this. There we go. We can look at a query in SQL against the vlogs view. So this is a specific view that will tell us how our replication is taking place. One thing I want to do, you don't want to just run a select star from vlogs. You want to order by log time descending, because that'll give you the most recent stuff first, right? And this is going to be SQL Server broker activation, the computer component type. You'll see some provider stuff in here and different things, right? Mostly SQL Server service broker activation. You can also scroll over and see the log text, what's taking place. So this is pretty chatty in terms of detail, but it's good information to have, as we try to service different things. Here we're trying to send changes. We can't because it didn't happen well the last time, and we can scroll through here and figure out why. There's some different CEDO things you'll see. We'll talk about CEDO a bit later, and so on. So this is a good place to look as well, right? One question you might have is, well, why don't we just write that into a log file instead of putting it in SQL? One of the reasons is it's a little bit interesting to try to get this kind of detail in a secure way into a log file, so we just write it to a database table instead, right? Okay. So what else? One of the other options that we have to be able to see what's going on in replication, it's kind of the catch-all. I actually start here, although this other information is really good, and I go here a lot. If I want to see in total what's going on with replication, I just run this stored procedure. This stored procedure is specifically designed to detail a lot of the specifics about how replication is running. So we just start at the top. We can tell that we're looking at the CAS. It's the top level site. It's active. Here's the server name, and here's the database. Here is the DRS queue status. We're enabled. We have 0 incoming messages. We have 27 outgoing messages that can't go because I've currently broken my child site. And then we have 106 that were processed in the last hour, 19 messages sent, and then there's some conflicts. You'll tend to have some conflicts. Generally, we resolve those pretty effectively. Then we see our replication groups that we saw before. We can see their state, they're active, the last update time for the status. We see the detail about the various sites, the sending site, the receiving site. So we will have data going back and forth both directions. The primary will send to the CAS, and then the CAS will send to the primary. So we see both of those. We see the replication groups. We see if they're active or degraded. Here we see some degraded status. And we put that top, so you'll be able to see that. Why? Because I've shut off communications, so we can't send anything, right? So as soon as I activate that back up, we'll be okay, right? And so you see all that kind of detail. So it's a really good view. If we go down further, we'll see even more data that we could look at, and so on. But so this is a really good holistic view of replication that provides some good detail to help us understand what's happening, right? Okay. So now let's get into the nitty-gritty of this a bit. So what if there are problems? Your link is degraded, but as you see up here, it's not degraded on everything. It's only degraded on a few replication groups. You've checked everything. Everything looks normal. You've confirmed replication tends to be happening well for other replication groups. Executives running, whatever. You may be in a situation where you need to reinitialize the replication group. And you can do that pretty easily with a few methods. I'm going to show you a PowerShell approach. There's other methods as well. You could drop some files in certain folders. You can run some SQL queries and such, but the easiest way is PowerShell, to me. So we'll do that in a minute, but you now have a choice. Do we reinitialize the entire database, which is a lot of traffic? Sometimes you need to. It's okay if you do. Again, work with someone who's comfortable with this to know what to do for sure. But it's better if you can just pick out a replication group to focus on and then initialize that, right? So, for example, I might want to initialize the site control data replication group. So how do I do that? Well, the first thing I need to do is understand what the ID of this replication group is. So if I go up to site control data and look at it, I know it's replication group 2, right? It shows active here. I could reinitialize it down at the child. I'll just do it here on the CAS to show you the command. But fairly easy. So I just pop into PowerShell, and I don't need the ConfigMgr commandlets. All I'm going to do is invoke, give me a minute to type this out, invoke WMI method, and I'm going to specify the namespace. All right, and then I'm going to specify the path. Now, this path is not specifying a replication group name. It's specifying a class. I'll show that to you in a minute. All right, actually, I'll show it to you now. So if I go into WebMTest, and connect, enum classes and recursive, and go down to SMS replication group, replication group. There we go. And double click on it. All I want to see is that there's this method, right? There are a number of methods programmatic methods we can call to take certain actions. And in this case, the initialize data action is going to let me specify what replication group I want to reinitialize and how, right? So I'm calling into the SMS replication group. I'm going to specify that I want to use the initialize data as the name of the method, and then I'm going to pass the arguments that that method needs. So I'm going to arguments list. All right. So I'm going to specify that I'm going to reinitialize group 2, replication group 2, or 10, or 20, or whichever one you want. In this case, I'm just going to use 2. I'm going to specify that I'm going to my site codes, CAS here, and then the primary, PR1. Right? And I hit go, and that's it. Very exciting. But what that did is it actually fired off to reinitialize that particular group across the databases. So that should be taking place now, right? If you wanted to reinitialize the whole thing, you would have to reinitialize one group at a time throughout the entire group. This PowerShell makes it really easy because all you have to do is really replace the number to get all the replication groups. Okay? All right. If you need to reinitialize all of the replication groups, you can. Just like I said, it causes a lot of traffic. Sometimes you need to, sometimes you don't, and so on. So, and as I wrap this section up a little bit, or start to, one of the things to understand is, again, this is kind of time critical. If you have a problem in replication, you want to catch it quickly, because we do have that by default 5-day retention interval, and beyond that we start to we'll initiate a full resync ourselves. And reminder, at that primary site, if you've added data within that 5-day window, we're just going to override it because we don't trust it now. We're out of that window, right? Okay. So cool. One more thing that I want to talk about here, pull this back out of the window, is something that can happen when a site goes into what's called maintenance mode. So maintenance mode, when I hear that, I think of two things in the System Center world. One is maintenance windows in ConfigMgr. That's not what we're talking about. The other thing is maintenance mode in Ops Manager, which again is something you can trigger from inside ConfigMgr, but it's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a specific mode of the site that does not allow you to make changes. It's a site that's in maintenance, meaning something's happening that is important enough that you cannot make changes in the system. That typically is replication, right? As a new site's added, as a site is going through some replication difficulties perhaps, we're going to snap into maintenance mode. You can actually read the console. You can launch the console. You'll see at the top, up here, it's going to be in read-only mode, right? Right up here, it's going to say, oops, that's not the ConfigMgr console. It's going to say up near the top, which you can't see because I've got that up here, it's going to say read-only. You can't make changes. It's protecting the system, right? Very rarely have I seen a site actually get stuck in maintenance mode. There is a way to actually force a site out of maintenance mode. There's a stored procedure that will let you do it. Let me pull this back in. I'll show this to you. I'm not suggesting that you run this just willy-nilly. You want to make sure everything's okay. And again, you shouldn't really have to run this, but this is there to help you get out of it if there's a problem, or can be leveraged to get out of it if there's a problem. And you would think it would be take out of maintenance mode. It's not. It's fake out of maintenance, and I don't know why. Maybe it's a typo, maybe it's not, but this is it nonetheless. So fake site out of maintenance, right? That can be leveraged to pull a site out of maintenance, right? Okay. Cool. So there's one last thing that I want to talk about before we wrap this up. It's this concept known as CEDO, which does leverage ConfigMgr SQL Replication to get its job done. So in ConfigMgr 2007 and previous, if you had an object that you created at a primary site, the only sites that could see that were the parent site and the child site, right? Certain things would be locked at the child site, so maybe you couldn't edit them because they were not owned by that site and different things. That's not the case in 2012. So it's a very real possibility that two administrators, one working at primary A, the other working at primary B, could have a task sequence or something like that open at the same time, and they're trying to edit it at the same time. And that could result in a little bit of confusion as data saved. One version overwrites the other and that kind of thing. So we want to protect against that. The way we do that is this mechanism called CEDO. CEDO stands for Serialized Editing of Data Objects. Basically, it's an enforcement mechanism that will lock an object that is being edited and prevent other users from editing that same object, right? They can view it, they can't edit it. Now, CEDO is something that happens very quickly. So as you open an object to edit, within milliseconds, there's going to be a replication that goes to your other sites to lock that object. It's not going to wait the minute or 5 minutes or whatever that some of those replication groups wait. It's going to go right now, right? There's also a timeout. If things just hang around open for a period of time, will be a timeout that we try to just get rid of that lock so that objects just don't hang around locked. But nevertheless, that's what it is, right? The easiest way to show you CEDO is to show it to you in action, right? So I could choose any of a number of different items. Let me pull in my other site for a minute. I could choose packages, applications, software updates, whatever. I'll just use I'm going to go ahead and start this back up because I need to do that because I'm going to need SQL replication working. And just because I'm not wanting a firewall on, I'm going to turn it off again. Cool. So that's all good. Now, I'm going to go and I'm going to edit now a different task sequence. So I'm actually locked right now because I had this down. That's okay. It'll come back. There we go. It's back. It's live. So I'm going to edit this. This is at my primary site, right? So I'm just going to leave that open, and I'm going to go to my CAS, and I'm going to find that exact same object, and I'm going to edit it. Let me get rid of SQL now. So I'm going to edit the task sequence here, right? So it's this task sequence, and I'm going to right-click and edit. And boom. This is CEDO, right? So what happened is when I opened it on my child site, we got a message that said, nope, this is locked. Anyone else who tries to open it will not be able to edit it live because someone else is actually editing it. Now, I can go open a read-only copy if I just want to view how it's configured. That's no problem. I can interact with it just like normal, but I can't make changes because it's locked, right? If I go back now and try to edit it, I get the same thing. What this tells me is either wait a little bit until these other changes are committed or reach out to the person who is actually making these changes and talk about what's being done. Maybe they're doing what you were planning to do. Maybe there's a need to coordinate with whatever you're doing, whatever it is. But this is a protection mechanism to make sure that we're all good. All right. So I'm going to go cancel this so that I restore functionality, right? And then I'm going to get rid of this. Okay, good enough because we're almost done. Just like anything else, there are inputs and places that you can go see what's happening in the database. So, for example, in the database, there's a number of tables that start with CEDO, and they're used to help you understand what's actually taking place. Very rarely, but it has happened, have I seen locks persist on objects that just don't get cleaned up for whatever reason. And so you can, if you are very careful and know what you're doing, go into the CEDO tables and resolve those locks. Okay. Two of the key tables are lock state and lock states, right? So if I select lock states, it's going to tell me the 6 different states that a lock could be in. It could be unassigned, could be assigned, meaning someone's editing it, could be pending, could be all of these, right? If I want to see what state a given object is in, then all I have to do is look at this, and I can, I don't know what the lock ID is. I have to figure this all out. There's other tables and such, but I can look at the lock state ID. I can see who the assigned site is, who owns it, that kind of thing, right? It's all in here. So a lot of good things you can pull out of the database. Again, this is educational. It's not suggesting to touch and modify all this. Make sure that if you do need to do this, that you're working with support, and folks there can help you do it. So that said, that's basically the tour of Data Replication in Configuration Manager 2012. End-to-end, Part 1, the introduction, Part 2, talking about file-based replication, and now ending up in Part 3, talking about ConfigMgr SQL Replication. So we'll wrap the series here and continue on with other topics as we go along.